So as we have been saying, one of the big questions in the US is over trade, with Donald Trump warning he will impose even more tariffs on America's trading partners if he wins November's election. But in a new report, the World Trade Organization is urging governments around the world not to use trade barriers such as tariffs to protect their workers, as our business reporter Jonathan Josephs reports.
From the ongoing disruption in the Red Sea to politicians and their taste for tariffs, global trade is under pressure. This report, though, is a reminder of its role dragging millions out of poverty, making the world a more equal place.
Since the foundation of the WTO 30 years ago, low and middle income countries have on average almost tripled their per capita GDP, and therefore narrowed the income gap to high income countries. So what we estimate is that up to 1/3 of this is due to trade cost reductions, in part facilitated by the WTO.
But there's also a warning that some countries are still being left behind. So just wonder which countries, which parts of the world is that, and how do we address those problems?
Most of them are located in Africa, the Middle East, Latin America, and the Caribbean. And there's basically two risk factors that we identify. One is not being integrated into international trade sufficiently, and the other one is, well, being integrated but being overly dependent on commodity exports.
Why is it appropriate to remind ourselves of how trade is closing that income gap now? Is there a particular problem in the world right now in terms of bridging the rest of that gap?
It's a concern of many of our members, how we can make trade more inclusive, both between country dimension, but also the within country dimension. But I think more broadly, of course, we have a crisis of globalization, and I think more and more people are convincing themselves that trade is part of the problem when it comes to build a more secure world, a more sustainable world, but also a more inclusive world. So we wanted to do a good faith attempt to share the evidence on trade and inclusiveness.
If we look at the more industrialized, wealthier countries that are putting up trade barriers at the moment, we look at the US and the EU, for example, and their action against China on electric vehicles. That's born of concerns about losing manufacturing, losing jobs, and national security concerns. Do you think the data justify those concerns?
One general point I can make, if I just look at workers now and domestic inequality protecting jobs. I mean, one thing that the report says very clearly is that protectionism is not the most effective way to help your workers. The answer is really to giving them the opportunity to benefit from international trade. And just like trade liberalization creates winners and losers, imposing tariffs also creates winners and losers. And that's one basic reason why I think that's not the way to help workers necessarily.
One thing that isn't denting the prospects of global trade is the effective ongoing closure of the important route that is the Red Sea because of attacks on ships. After a rare fall last year, it's set to grow once again as economies around the world bounce back from energy and inflation shocks. Jonathan Josephs, BBC News.
Now, before we wrap up, let's head